Hello, today I'm reading from Seize the Time from April 1976. The name of the article is History of the Early Women's Movement. The early women's movement was organized around a broad spectrum of demands, most of which reflected the middle-class bias of the movement and the moralistic approach of the women involved. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 passed 11 resolutions including religious freedom, equality in marriage, the right to testify, to own property, equal education, equal guardianship of children, and the right to vote. For the thousands of immigrant women who entered the workforce in the early 1840s, these demands meant little. They had no property or leisure to attend school. Even the resolutions that dealt with labor, equal pay for equal work, the right to any job they were qualified for, and the right to control her own wages applied primarily to educated professional women. In spite of the class bias of the early women's movement, it was tremendously important. Allied with the abolition movement, it challenged the bourgeois ideas that were the foundation of society. Women were, in many ways, the property of their husbands and did not have any of the rights that the Seneca Falls Convention called for. After 1848, many feminists were active in abolition. Among abolitionists, they found male support for their cause. At the same time, leaders of the abolition movement supported women's rights because the women brought energy and strength to their cause. Black abolitionists and women's rights. Some of the strongest advocates of women's rights were Black abolitionists. Leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman pushed Black societies to pass resolutions supporting women's rights. Most active Black women were involved in abolition rather than women's rights struggles because abolition meant survival, whereas women's rights meant political equality. Black women who supported those rights did so primarily because, number one, they wanted the right to attend and speak at anti-slavery meetings, and number two, they desired their full share of political rights. It was a Black woman, Maria W. Stewart, who was the first native-born American woman to speak in public. In 1851, Sojourner Truth saved a women's rights convention from being taken over by antagonistic male hecklers. The middle-class white women, timid about speaking in public, were unable to answer the arguments that they were unfit for equal rights. Sojourner got up and attacked the charge that women were weak with her famous speech, "Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could lead me. And ain't I a woman?" Originally, some white women at that convention had asked the president not to allow her to speak because they didn't want their cause to be associated with abolition and N-words. The racist attitude of those women was typical of non-abolitionist women in the movement. Even among abolitionist women, there was little understanding of or attention paid to slave women as women. There was a tendency to equate the status of white women with that of a slave. The lack of understanding of the difference in their oppression showed the inability of the white abolition and women's movements to deal with racist ideology. While the two movements supported each other for almost a quarter of a century, the alliance was based almost totally on mutual aid. They had no sense of struggling against a common enemy. When expediency called for it, they did not hesitate to sell each other out. After the Civil War, feminism split into two camps: the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was concerned almost entirely with the ballot, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, which worked for far-reaching institutional changes for women. The split occurred over the question of the support for the 14th and 15th Amendments. The bulk of the women who joined NWSA, which was led by Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, campaigned against the amendment because they did not include women. In fact, the 14th Amendment introduced the word male into the Constitution. The campaign those women waged against the amendments became increasingly white supremacist, arguing for the vote for white women to ensure a white American-born majority at the polls. It was, in part, that white supremacist attitude that caused the Equal Rights Association to fall apart in 1869, ending the alliance between the abolition and women's movements. 14th and 15th Amendments. During the Civil War, female reformers threw their energies into the war effort, bringing a halt to the women's movement. The National Women's Loyal League, including Stanton, Anthony, and Lucy Stone in the leadership, collected 400,000 signatures in support of the 13th Abolition Amendment and passed a resolution calling for equal rights for women and blacks. The feminists, having struggled hard for emancipation, expected to be rewarded for their labor by being included in the suffrage legislation. But the 14th Amendment, proposed in 1866, was explicitly limited to male citizens. Feminists were horrified by the blatant ignoring of their rights. Black abolitionists and their allies urged the feminists to support the amendment because it had the possibility of ending the intense repression directed against former slaves. Republican Party bureaucrats urged the feminists to support it to keep the party together. There were signs of a split in the North, and the party wanted the Southern black vote to ensure their majority in Congress. They saw no advantage for themselves in white women getting the vote. To them, women's suffrage was merely a controversial, radical issue which angered their conservative male members. The 15th Amendment outlawed racial discrimination at the polls. Stanton summed up their position against that amendment. Are you willing to have the colored man enfranchised before the woman? I say no. I would not trust him with my rights, degraded, oppressed himself. He would be more despotic with the governing power than ever our Saxon rulers are. If women are still to be represented by men, then I say let only the highest type of manhood stand at the helm of state. Narrowing the vision. There were white women who understood the amendments represented survival to blacks, especially in the South, and they campaigned for them. Among them was Lucy Stone, one of the founders of the AWSA. The fact that the women who formed the AWSA had correctly allied themselves with former slaves did not mean they were politically more conscious. On the contrary, many were just as racist as the NWSA women, but were easily bullied into putting their cause second because they did not believe women should be treated equally in anything but the vote. They supported suffrage in large part because of women's moral uprightness and the need for reform. While the NWSA emphasized the inalienable rights of females as individuals, the struggle for women's suffrage in opposition to the 14th and 15th Amendments had forced the radical feminists to soften their position on social and sexual freedom in order to gain allies. Political climate in pre-Civil War days favorable to their cause turned increasingly hostile. Faced with this hostility, the NWSA narrowed its focus more and more to suffrage and in 1890 merged with AWSA, there being little difference between the two by that point. The women's movement and labor. In 1920, women finally won the vote. But by that time, the campaign had become so narrow that the victory all but ended the women's movement. To win the vote, leaders pushed for the lowest political unity that white, middle-class women could unite around, meaning unity that did not challenge their privileged position. Naturally, their class interests conflicted with those of the thousands of poor, largely immigrant women who made up the bulk of the female workforce. At the turn of the century, one of the arguments the suffragists used most effectively was that women's primary duty was to the health of her children and to the cleanliness of her home. To do her duty effectively, she needed to vote. The fulfillment of her responsibilities depended on sanitation policies, housing standards, etc. Thus, they countered the allegation that suffragists sought to destroy the home. That women's duty was to cleanliness of the home was the same argument employers used to oppress women workers. Women did not belong in the workforce. Therefore, it was all right to pay them $3.50 a week for 12 hours of work a day. Where the early women's movement had at least challenged the sexist ideas that led to the oppression of women workers, suffragists at the turn of the century supported those ideas. In 1903, the Women's Trade Union League, WTUL, was established by a coalition of settlement house workers and labor officials to assist in the organization of women workers into trade unions. In its early years, the WTUL honestly attempted to follow the lead of working women, but the WTUL was not exempt from the forces around them. The League was split between the reformers, who sought legislation and encouraged rich sympathizers to join the League, and the unionists, who felt emphasis should be placed on organizing the workers into unions. The unionists saw that the influence of the socialites, the wives of the bosses, in the League would compromise them politically. History proved them to be correct. The reformist position won out. The League turned increasingly toward legislative reform and the spiritual uplifting of factory workers. Their membership fell, and by 1930, WTUL's budget was less than $10,000, and they had no full-time organizers. Conclusion. From the beginning of the women's movement, the majority of female social reformers were white, middle-class women. Their position gave them the leisure to work for change. It also blinded them to the true forces of change. They understood that they were oppressed, but didn't connect that oppression with the class structure of their society or understand that their liberation lay in its destruction. Rather, they fought for the right to take part in the existing society, having no clear idea of who their enemy was. They had no concept of who their allies were. In studying the errors of the early women's movement, We must keep in mind that they come from the material forces that gave rise to it, not from character flaws in the women involved. They went so far as that period of history allowed. They supported abolition because it was morally right, and later because the abolitionists supported them. But there is no evidence that the white suffragists saw any real connection between the liberation of Black people and themselves. Their class bias kept them from seeing the strengths that the thousands of working women could have brought to the women's movement. Their privileged position depended on the oppression of working women as well as slaves, so they made little attempt to include working women in their demands. When they did support workers' struggles, it was usually to teach the ignorant masses their superior moral values. Today's women's movement, coming out of present material conditions, has the basis to, but no guarantee that it will, overcome the racism and class bias of our early sisters. While understanding the different conditions we are working in, we can still draw lessons from them and struggle against making the same deadly errors. I just want to add that a common theme that I have been seeing in the research that I have been doing is that progress is not perfect. We all make mistakes, and when we're trying to move in the right direction, we're probably going to do some things wrong. When we're trying to do our best, we're probably going to do some things wrong. But what can we do from that? We can learn and we can be better. And that's kind of how I feel about the person that wrote this. Is I believe that's what they're saying, is that it was necessary. It wasn't perfect. And white women at that time still didn't realize that that they were considered below all men. In the Constitution, Black men could vote more than 50 years before white women could vote. So that should have been a clue, but it took us a while to learn it. But I think more and more of us white women are understanding that now, and understanding that we all have to join together, and it's all of us against the rich billionaires, and there's not many of them. There's more of us, and the power of the people is greater than the people in power. See you on the next one.